Karl Marx was born on May 5, 1818, in the town of Trier, located in western Germany, in close proximity to today's border with Luxembourg. During the first half of the 19th century, this town was situated within a significant portion of the German Rhineland, which had come under the governance of the Kingdom of Prussia during the 18th and early 19th centuries. Marx's father, Heinrich Marx, was a German lawyer of Jewish descent, whose own father held the position of rabbi. His birth name was Herschel Levy. However, he altered it shortly after Karl's birth, upon renouncing his Judaism and converting to Lutheran Christianity, motivated by the rising anti-Semitism in Europe during the 19th century. He enjoyed a successful career as a lawyer, and the family owned several vineyards that provided them with supplementary income. Karl's mother, Henriette, was a Dutch-born woman who wed Heinrich in 1814. The union produced 9 children, with Karl being the third. Unfortunately, 2 of these children would pass away in infancy, resulting in Karl growing up alongside 6 siblings. The Marx family experienced a relatively prosperous lifestyle during Karl's upbringing. While he was still an infant, they relocated to a 10-room townhouse in Trier, clearly indicative of their upper-middle-class economic standing. Their household was secular, engaged with the ideas of rationalism and liberalism that had permeated Europe during the Enlightenment of the 18th century. Karl was homeschooled by his well-educated father until he reached the age of 12. Subsequently, he was enrolled in a school in Trier, operated by Hugh Wittenbach, a figure who soon faced considerable controversy due to his radical teaching curriculum, which prompted intervention from Prussian authorities to actively alter the pedagogical methods employed and the literature assigned at the gymnasium. Aside from these matters, Marx's childhood appeared to be relatively uneventful. He seldom reflected on his early years in any of his writings. Marx's life and political philosophy were influenced by the events that were just beginning to intensify across the European continent as he grew up as a child. The Industrial Revolution had commenced in England during the 1770s when proto-industrialists, particularly those who dominated the nation's textile trade, began to realize that they could significantly enhance their profits by introducing machines to perform the weaving processes that had traditionally been conducted by hand. They further discovered that they could achieve what is now termed economies of scale by situating large numbers of these machines within a singular building, which would soon be referred to as a factory. As steam engines were subsequently introduced to expedite the production process, the demand for coal to fuel these engines surged. This marked the commencement of the Industrial Revolution. However, its spread to Europe was slow, as the rest of the continent took time to embrace the new ideas. This lethargy was intensified by the turmoil created by the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars between 1792 and 1815. However, from the 1820s onwards, numerous countries on the continent commenced to industrialize at an accelerated pace. The Low Countries were the first, followed by regions of northern France and western Germany, particularly in the Rhineland and Ruhr areas where coal and mineral resources were plentiful. Marx was consequently born into a region that was developing as one of the principal centers of the Industrial Revolution on the continent from the 1820s onwards as he was maturing there. The Industrial Revolution was a double-edged sword in numerous respects. It constituted one of the pivotal social and economic phenomena which fostered the modern world. The economies of European states and other Western nations in the Americas, such as the United States, Canada, and Argentina, began to undergo historically unprecedented growth as a consequence of it, and the material prosperity of individuals in countries such as England and Germany surpassed any society in human history had ever experienced. Our lives of comfort and convenience in the 21st century are in many aspects the offspring of the Industrial Revolution. Nevertheless, it brought with it its own pressures. In medieval and early modern eras, the majority of individuals were agricultural laborers. They labored diligently at specific times of the year, particularly during the sowing season and the harvest. But for much of the year, they had little work to engage in. Life was uncertain, and people were predominantly quite impoverished, yet it was also not overtly burdensome at times. Industrialization transformed that reality. Reforms to agricultural practices and burgeoning populations compelled large numbers of people into burgeoning industrial cities such as Manchester, Sheffield, Newcastle, Liège, and Aachen, which had been modest towns a generation or two prior. There, They were compensated poorly for working exceedingly long hours in factories and mines, or for laying railway tracks and constructing steamships from the 1830s and 1840s onwards. Adult men were anticipated to work up to 70 hours a week in certain instances, while women and children as young as 8 or 9 were laboring 55 or 60 hours a week. When these urban workers, or the proletariat as figures like Marx would soon designate them, returned home, it was to cramped tenements afflicted by outbreaks of the Blue Death, the cholera epidemic that devastated Europe's industrial cities between the 1830s and the 1890s. This is the context that must be considered when evaluating Marx's subsequent career. In 1835, after reaching the age of 17 in May of that year, Marx was sent to study at the University of Bonn, located not far to the north of his hometown Trier. A disagreement with his father regarding the prospective direction of his studies and career prompted Karl, who was more inclined towards philosophy, to partially pursue law. His focus never concentrated on it. Instead, he expressed a greater interest in extracurricular activities, such as his membership in the Trier Tavern Club, the purpose of which can be inferred from its name. Within a year, his parents, exasperated by his apparent waywardness, insisted that Karl transfer to the University of Berlin, a more prestigious and stricter institution. He would pursue his studies here for the next several years, first for a BA and subsequently for a more advanced degree. These were formative years for him. His father passed away in 1838, and despite their disagreements, the two had maintained a relatively close relationship. Heinrich's death created both an emotional and material void, leaving the surviving members of the large Marx family suddenly facing a precarious financial future. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Karl explored various career options, at one point attempting to write fictional novels and plays in the late 1830s, although he soon abandoned these literary ambitions. Ultimately, Marx became captivated by the philosophical thought of Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel during his studies in Berlin. Hegel had only recently passed away in the Prussian capital in 1831, and many figures at the University of Berlin had known and collaborated with him. His letters were also undergoing editing there, rendering the study of Hegel's thought somewhat fashionable at that time. Marx quickly became a member of the Young Hegelians, a collective of students and radicals who criticized the conservative Prussian government and who aligned with Hegel's notion that individual liberty and the establishment of a more permissive society were social goods. Through his examination of Hegel and his affiliation with the Young Hegelians, Marx ultimately began a doctoral dissertation at the University of Jena under the mentorship of Bruno Bauer, a former pupil of Hegel. This dissertation was titled "The Difference Between the Democritean and Epicurean Philosophy of Nature," and entailed a comparative analysis of the works of Democritus and Epicurus, two ancient Greek philosophers from the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. One of these philosophers, Democritus, had also played an essential role in the early history of physics by hypothesizing the existence of atoms, whereas Epicurus was the founder of the Epicurean philosophical school. Marx defended his thesis in 1841. After completing his studies at Berlin and Jena, Marx contemplated pursuing an academic career and had taught intermittently by that time. However, the environment within the Kingdom of Prussia was far from supportive of this aspiration, and the Young Hegelians had been under surveillance by the authorities due to their perceived political radicalism. Consequently, he opted to become a political writer, but soon encountered difficulties with the press censors in Berlin. Realizing that there was little opportunity for the free expression of his ideas within the Kingdom of Prussia, Marx departed for Paris in October 1843. This marked the commencement of a period lasting approximately 6 years, in which he relocated frequently. For example, 2 years spent in the French capital came to a conclusion in 1845 after Marx, along with a group of other radical political writers, was expelled following a request from the Prussians to the French government due to their publication of several articles that were critical of the Prussian government. This situation compelled Marx to move to Brussels, the capital of the Kingdom of Belgium, which was one of Europe's newest independent nations, having emerged after enduring centuries of Burgundian, Spanish, and Austrian rule following the Belgian Revolution of 1830. He would work from Brussels for the subsequent 3 years, before also being expelled from there for violating a pledge not to engage in subversive activities. A brief period would ensue in Cologne before Marx established his residence in London in 1849. By the time Marx embraced the lifestyle of a nomadic political writer in 1843, he was already a married man. His spouse was Jenny von Westphalen, a member of a family belonging to the lower aristocracy in Western Germany. She was 4 years older than Karl, and they had known one another in Trier during their childhood and teenage years. They later rekindled their acquaintance and wed in 1843, despite her family's reservations regarding her marrying the heavily bearded, bohemian, and seemingly dissolute political writer. Such relationships could be complex. Karl would maintain a cordial relationship with Jenny's brother, Ferdinand, who served as the Minister of the Interior of Prussia for much of the 1850s, overseeing policies that were the antithesis of Marx's advocacy. The marriage would yield 7 children, although 4 would succumb in infancy and childhood, a disproportionately high percentage during a time when infant mortality was rapidly decreasing due to medical advancements. The 3 who survived into adulthood were all daughters: Jenny, Laura, and Eleanor. Each would become political actors, writers, and socialists. The Marx family life was tumultuous. They were never affluent or even comfortable, residing for many years in a 2-room house in London, while spending considerable time moving around, with Karl renting homes under pseudonyms to evade political interference in his activities. He could be perceived as a neglectful father who prioritized advancing his own writing career over the material well-being of his family. However, those who knew the family described him as a devoted father, and his daughter's subsequent choices indicate an affinity for their father's work. These itinerant years, moving between Berlin, Paris, Brussels, and Cologne during the 1840s, were among the most productive in Marx's life. He authored numerous books and articles during this period, although he was unable to secure a publisher for many of them due to their content and his reputation, as someone being monitored by the Prussian censors and others abroad. These encompassed a broad array of subjects. A critique of Hegel's philosophy of right was, as the title explicitly denotes, a contemplation of aspects of Hegel's philosophical concepts. Additional work evaluated the philosophical perspectives of James Mill and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, 2 relatively contemporary philosophers from Scotland and France. An article entitled On the Jewish Question was published in 1844 and deliberated on the matter of Jewish freedoms in the Kingdom of Prussia. It has peculiarly resulted in accusations of anti-Semitism directed at Marx, despite the fact that he was himself Jewish, notwithstanding being the son of a secular Jewish father who had converted to Christianity for predominantly social and economic motivations. Ultimately, in 1847, Marx delivered a lecture which was subsequently published under the title of Wage Labor and Capital. In this work, he commenced to articulate his thoughts regarding material advancement and how industrialization and the accumulation of capital were instigating class conflict throughout Europe. Throughout these years, Marx was initiating his extensive collaboration with Friedrich Engels. Engels was a fellow German. He was 2.5 years younger than Marx and originated from a considerably affluent family. His father, Friedrich Stunyer, was a textile entrepreneur, one who owned mills and factories in the town of Barmen in western Germany and also in Salford, a suburb of the industrial metropolis that Manchester in the north of England had evolved into, supported by its central role in the cotton industry during the Industrial Revolution. Friedrich's parents had aspired for him to succeed in the family business, but by the time he was 20 years of age, he was already exhibiting a critical stance toward his family's wealth. In Berlin, Engels commenced attending lectures at the University of Berlin, developed an interest in Hegel's work, and subsequently forged a bond with Marx over mutual interests and political ideologies following their initial meeting in late 1842. They would collaborate on an extensive number of co-authored works. However, Engels was a significant writer in his own right. His 1845 book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, is, for example, regarded as a vital examination of the impoverishment and degradation associated with industrialization in the mid-19th century. Many decades later, it was also due to Engels that the second and third volumes of Marx's principal work, Das Kapital, were published posthumously. Marx and Engels were not merely co-authors of several works together, they were also partners in political endeavors. One such early initiative was the establishment of the Communist Correspondence Committee. This was an organization comprised of individuals like themselves who held similar perspectives on politics, economics, and society, and resided in Brussels, London, Paris, and Cologne, 4 cities in relatively close proximity to one another in Western Europe, enabling members of the committee to exchange correspondence swiftly. The designation communist was adopted as it gained popularity in various regions of Western and Central Europe during the late 1830s and 40s, to describe individuals whose political ideologies were similar to the radical left wing of the Jacobin clubs that had spearheaded the French Revolution throughout the first half of the 1790s. They identified themselves as politically aligned with the sans-culottes of Paris during the Revolution, the working-class Parisians who were instrumental, among other significant actions, in the storming of the Bastille prison and the decision to depose the royal family from Versailles, placing them under effective house arrest in Paris in 1789. This partly contributed to the origin of the term communist. However, over time, it would also acquire the additional connotation of advocating for communal ownership of goods within a society. The Communist Correspondence Committee subsequently united with a comparable organization known as the League of the Just, following a conference in London in the early summer of 1847. The newly formed entity was designated the Communist League. From its establishment, Marx and Engels emerged as prominent figures within the Communist League. They participated in a second assembly of its membership in London during late November and early December 1847. It was determined at that meeting that Marx and his colleague would draft a manifesto delineating the objectives of the Communist League. The work advanced swiftly. Over the duration of approximately 6 weeks during the winter of 1847, Marx composed what would ultimately become the Communist Manifesto, and subsequently had Engels review it. The writing process was tumultuous, and Marx exhibited procrastination regarding it in January 1848. Ultimately, he completed the typescript in early February and dispatched it to London, where the publishing team for the Communist League expedited it through the publication process. It was disseminated in the English capital in late February 1848. Although the text was credited to both Marx and Engels, the majority of evaluations of the writing process tend to assert that Marx was the principal author, with Engels providing only minimal input, although the overall tone and essence of the content had been shaped through dialogues between the two over the preceding half-decade prior to Marx's engagement in writing. The Communist Manifesto, given its significant influence in modern world history, is, in fact, quite brief, resembling a pamphlet more than a conventional book. It extends to just around 14,000 words in contemporary editions, contingent on the editorial conventions applied. Marx immediately articulated his perspective that history is fundamentally a narrative of conflicts between disparate economic and social classes. In ancient Rome, this distinction existed among patricians, plebeians, and slaves. During the medieval era, it was present between lords and knights, as well as the serfs who cultivated their fields. In the industrial age, Marx contended that the conflict arose between the bourgeois factory owners and the professional classes that governed society, along with the expanding proletariat of urban workers. He harshly criticized the transformations industrialization had imposed on society, declaring, "The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family relation to a mere money relation." Across the board, the bourgeois monopoly on industrial power and capitalism was fostering despair in regions where material advancement should have significantly enhanced individual lives. He was particularly vocal about the way in which child labor in factories and mines had increased. The resolution, Marx posited, was advocated by the Communist League and similar organizations. Private property should be abolished, and from that point forward, factories, mines, shipyards, farms, and other economic and social utilities ought to be subordinated to communal state ownership. Once accomplished, collective decisions could be undertaken by the proletariat to broaden access to education, enhance working conditions, and ensure an equitable distribution of the advantages associated with industrial growth and material advancement. Marx concluded his pamphlet with a renowned phrase which served as the slogan of the Communist League: "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." The Communist Manifesto has emerged as one of the most debated texts ever crafted. This stands in stark contrast to its relatively uncontroversial nature at the time it was published. It essentially represented the delineation of the policy platform of a nascent political movement. Political groups and parties frequently release policy documents. Revolutionary texts and idealistic political declarations of this nature were not particularly novel. In England during the Civil War period of the 1640s, a plethora of revolutionary proposals to restructure the entire foundation of society had been conceived. One notable figure from that time, John Milton, a political idealist, had significantly impacted Marx's viewpoints as expressed in his work, Paradise Lost. The very idea of establishing a United States of America, from the British 13 colonies stretching from New Hampshire to Georgia, was considered radical when the Founding Fathers formulated it in 1776. Perhaps most crucially, political treatises advocating for political and social utopias of the nature described in the Communist Manifesto were penned as far back as the 4th century BC, when the Athenian philosopher and political scientist Plato authored The Republic, an extensive commentary on the ideal state. Plato had supported a model akin to the communal ownership of goods, and it could also be argued that the English Lord Chancellor during King Henry VIII's reign, Sir Thomas More, had proposed proto-communist concepts in his renowned treatise, Utopia. In this regard, the text was by no means a completely novel breakthrough in European political thought. It has been conjectured that Marx was largely drunk while composing the Communist Manifesto, a fact which would be quite ironic considering that this brief treatise would ultimately evolve into one of the most impactful writings ever created. Part of the reason for his procrastination in completing it in January 1848 was due to his trip to Ghent to establish a branch of the Communist League there, and he spent a week and a half in the smaller Belgian city, much of this time spent inebriated, before returning to Brussels, where an ultimatum from the League headquarters in London to finalize the manifesto awaited him. He then hastened to complete it over the subsequent few days. That Marx was consuming alcohol during this time was indisputable. The available evidence certainly implies that he met the criteria for a high-functioning alcoholic. He commenced heavy drinking during his early university years in Bonn and sustained this habit for the next half a century. This was not the standard diet of nearly constant beer consumption that defined European life in early modern and pre-modern eras, especially in urban areas where drinking alcohol was safer than consuming contaminated water. But rather, Marx exhibited a preference for wine and spirits, all in conjunction with a lavish diet and cigars. By the late 1840s, by which time he was just entering his 30s, he had an increasing array of health issues, some likely connected to liver disease. Even as the Communist Manifesto was being published in London at the close of February 1848, a surge of revolutionary passion was sweeping throughout Europe. This initiation occurred in the city of Palermo on the island of Sicily in January 1848 and swiftly propagated across the continent. By March and April, substantial uprisings were occurring in locations such as Poland, Hungary, France, much of Germany, Denmark, the Swiss Confederation, and Ireland, while nearly every other nation observed public demonstrations, if not full-scale revolts. The revolutions of 1848, or the springtime of the people, as it would later become known, resulted in extensive political transformations in countries such as France, Hungary, and Italy, and threatened to bring about the overthrow of entire governments in Germany and other areas. In the aftermath of these revolutions, there were repressive measures against perceived political extremism. Marx, who had just returned to Cologne after facing pressure from the Belgian government due to his political beliefs amid the revolutions affecting the continent, soon also endured harassment from the Prussian government because of his involvement in the Communist League, and was ultimately requested to leave the kingdom entirely. This was the context in which the Marx family moved to London. Marx would spend the remainder of his life established in the British capital, in a country which was more liberal-minded than virtually any other nation in Europe at that time, with extensive censorship enforced in other capitals, of a nature that would have prevented him from having his work published. In London, Marx found sufficient inspiration in the events of 1848 and 1849 occurring throughout Europe, despite the fact that the revolutions had predominantly concluded with suppression and violent crackdowns, prompting him to commence researching and writing some retrospective analyses on that other significant European revolutionary movement, the French Revolution of 1789 and its aftermath during the 1790s. For communists and for left-leaning socialists of all varieties, the French Revolution was regarded as one of the seminal events in human history. Whereas the American Revolution had been chiefly driven by affluent urban bourgeois individuals and wealthy plantation owners, the French insurrection had, to a considerable extent, been led by the sans-culottes urban workers of Paris and the Jacobean clubs of radical revolutionaries. It had represented both a movement aimed at overthrowing the ancien regime of crown, aristocracy, and church, as well as an endeavor to establish a completely new societal structure. Marx and many others aspired to initiate a new revolution of this nature. To that end, from 1849 into the early 1850s, he engaged in extensive writing in an attempt to analyze what had gone awry in France during the 1790s to thwart the revolution, and ultimately lead it into the monarchy of Napoleon Bonaparte, contrasting it with the contemporary ascent to power of Charles Louis Bonaparte, Napoleon's nephew, as president of France amidst the Revolution of 1848. He would later declare himself Napoleon III, a new emperor of the French. Marx articulated that the bourgeois had manipulated the French proletariat in such a way as to lead them to accept the abandonment of the revolution in 1799 and the subsequent acceptance of Bonaparte as first consul and then emperor of the French in 1804. Comparable principles had recently contributed to the erosion of the 1848 revolution in France and the emergence of another Bonaparte to power. While Marx may have felt compelled to comment on and analyze the various revolutionary movements across the continent, he also needed to earn a living in London following his relocation there. He secured some employment as a journalist, serving as a London-based correspondent for the New York Daily Tribune, while also occasionally writing for several other publications. Much of this work involved summarizing British political developments and rendering them comprehensible for an American audience, particularly developments occurring at the British Parliament at Westminster during a notably active period in the country's legislative history. This role was precarious, and Marx was frequently only compensated for articles that were accepted for publication, resulting in an unstable income stream. The Marx family was not impoverished, however, they hardly enjoyed an affluent lifestyle in London, and Karl would have encountered challenges in continuing his unpaid research and writing had it not been for the financial support provided by Engels, whose family's wealth afforded him an independent income stream. During these years in London, Marx was also interested in the ongoing political tensions in the United States, which centered around the issue of slavery, and would ultimately culminate in the American Civil War in 1861. This interest was fueled by his observations of the contentious state of U.S. politics in the 1850s, and subsequently, the final descent into conflict following the election of Abraham Lincoln during the 1860 presidential election. However, his collection of essays on this topic, published as a series of articles for the New York Daily Tribune and Die Press in Vienna between 1860 and 1866, also sought a broader analysis of the economic divisions between the free northern states and the slave-holding southern states that had instigated the conflict initially. Marx firmly aligned with the Union in the war and supported the anti-slavery cause, to the extent that it ultimately resulted in the loss of his position writing for the New York Daily Tribune after the paper's board opted for a notably neutral stance in the war in 1863, contending that a peaceful resolution between the North and South, one that might permit some form of slavery in regions such as Virginia and the Carolinas, was achievable. At that point, Marx withdrew from the publication and secured other employment with Die Presse and other outlets. Fortunately, by that time, one of his other works, A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, published in 1859, was performing well enough that Marx found himself in a more stable financial position. The conclusion of his tenure at the New York Daily Tribune and his increase in income enabled Marx to focus on a substantial work that had been in progress for quite some time. This would serve as the principal distillation of his political theories. He dedicated considerable time to its composition in the reading rooms of the British Museum in London, whose archival and library sections are the British Library today. It was within this environment that Marx compiled hundreds of pages of notes on a variety of issues concerning class relations and related topics. The outcome would be a 3-volume work released gradually over several decades, titled Das Kapital, Kritik der politischen Ökonomie, which transliterates to Capital, a critique of political economy. The first volume of Das Kapital was published in 1867. It constituted a lengthy work in its own right, comprising 500 to 600 pages in most contemporary editions. Subsequently, it was augmented by volumes 2 and 3, released posthumously in 1885 and 1894 respectively, after Engels completed the two texts based on Marx's extensive notes and drafts. Collectively, the 3 volumes tend to exceed 1,000 pages in modern editions that attempt to consolidate them into one volume, and this can only be accomplished by using very small print or summarizing substantial sections of the text. It is therefore a remarkably extensive work, comprising over 1 million words in most contemporary editions, if footnotes or endnotes are incorporated. Given its considerable length, there exists a plethora of elements within Das Kapital, far exceeding those found in the rather meager Communist Manifesto. 2 principal aspects of it warrant attention. Das Kapital provided the clearest expression of Marx's perspectives on historical materialism. This perspective views history as being primarily characterized by conflict among different economic classes. This notion is not entirely revolutionary in today's discourse. However, during the mid-19th century, it was groundbreaking. Up until that time, most historians, or those who employed historical arguments, tended to evaluate human history as focusing on conflicts between various ethnic groups or on empires, kingdoms, and nation-states. If one were to peruse a 19th century European history book, one would invariably encounter chapters detailing conflicts between England and France, the German states and the papacy, and Spain and Portugal. Monarchs, sovereigns, lords, and popes were prominently featured, and it was supposedly religion and territorial power that drove their actions. In contrast, little attention was paid to the activities and motivations of the vast majority of the population within such countries. Marx composed his writings in response to this narrative. He contended that history was fundamentally a struggle between differing economic classes rather than between nation-states. In this re-envisioning, Western European history during the High Middle Ages was not, for instance, a story of warfare between the French and English crowns, but rather of the French and English nobility collectively oppressing the feudal peasantry. Over time, the relationships between economic classes evolved as various technological innovations altered the modes of production of food and goods. As a result, Europe's recent history had been tumultuous and was leading to class conflict due to the recent advancements of the Industrial Revolution, which had positioned the bourgeoisie, a class that had previously vanquished the old feudal nobility centuries prior, against the emerging industrial proletariat. In Marx's view, historical materialism provided a framework for elucidating nearly all historical developments. While numerous individuals may contest the political objectives that Marx intended to achieve through the formulation of this theory, or assert that he placed excessive weight on material issues as the axis upon which all historical events revolve, it cannot be denied that he contributed to a fundamental reevaluation of historical methodology, one which underscored how economic developments and class conflict were equally significant as nationalism or the actions of prominent rulers and statesmen. This notion of historical materialism is intrinsically connected to one of the other central elements of Marxist philosophy, as articulated in Das Kapital. This is referred to as the Marxist dialectic or dialectical materialism. In developing this concept, Marx was responding to the dialectical methods advocated by Hegel decades earlier. The Hegelian dialectic posited that ideas frequently exist in fundamental conflict with one another. Yet this tension could yield a more complex resolution. For example, a person might present an idea or thesis regarding a philosophical issue. Subsequently, a second individual or group would present a counter-argument or antithesis. In numerous instances, neither party would be entirely accurate. However, the fundamental tension between the two arguments would yield a more developed synthesis that drew from both thesis and antithesis to create a synthesis. The Hegelian concept ultimately has its origins in the philosophical methodologies of Plato. Marx subsequently appropriated and transformed this dialectical approach, infusing it with arguments pertaining to political economy and metaphysics. His contention was that society and nature possess a physical existence that extends beyond the impressions humans form in their minds, thus warranting study independent of individual perceptions of society. In this regard, he rejected Hegel's ideas and a long lineage of other European philosophers, tracing back to René Descartes, who established the Cartesian school of metaphysics in the mid-17th century. For Marx, the individual could be somewhat overlooked. What held significance within this dialectical methodology was that economic groups experienced tension with one another, resulting in changes in the physical world, albeit often contradictory or challenging to explain. The Marxist dialectic is among the more intricate elements of Marx's thought in Das Kapital and his political and philosophical perspective more broadly. It is also one of the most contentious. Many assert that by emphasizing the material world and its operations while rejecting Hegel's Cartesianism, Marx was fundamentally negating the inherent value of the individual in society. The assertion here is that by stating that the material relations between economic groups in the world and their interactions with nature, rather than individual perceptions of the same, were of paramount importance, Marx was, in effect, trivializing the worth of individuals. It is readily apparent why this could be regarded as a contentious viewpoint, particularly when we take into account that Joseph Stalin authored a paper entitled Dialectical and Historical Materialism, which was first published in 1938 during the height of the Great Purge he was inflicting upon Russia at that time. It could be argued that Marx's dialectical reasoning was consequently responsible for the worst excesses of the Soviet Union and other communist regimes in subsequent decades. Moreover, the Marxist dialectic is not the sole aspect of Marx's work deemed controversial. His perspective on historical materialism, while serving as a highly useful corrective to the traditional view of history as a series of clashes between kingdoms and nation-states, when exaggerated, has led to an overt focus on class struggles as being the underlying factor behind all historical phenomena. Finally, his promotion of collective ownership and management of resources may have been regarded as idealistic by many in the 20th century, yet what Marx neglected was the potential for authoritarianism to be employed in pursuit of this goal. Although Marx himself cannot be classified as an authoritarian by any means, he did not recognize that attempts to realize his theories could lead to despotic regimes, particularly in nations like Russia, that had a long-standing tradition of autocratic rule. Practical initiatives aimed at advancing the communist agenda in the tangible world, rather than merely on paper, were in motion even as Marx composed the first volume of Das Kapital in the mid-1860s. In 1864, a coalition of socialist, communist, and other leftist radical groups from across Europe convened at a meeting in the Queen's Theatre in London on the 28th of September. They termed themselves the International Workingmen's Association, though within contemporary communist historiography, this organization is recognized as the First International, being the initial entity that asserted representation of communist factions globally, though in practice this mostly pertained to Europe at that time, as communism had only minimally disseminated elsewhere, with a few proponents in the Americas being the sole significant exception. The impetus for the assembly was the Polish uprising against Russian domination in 1863, and the realization that grassroots labor organizations, along with those that represented groups such as the oppressed Polish subjects of the Russian Empire, could attain greater success if they coordinated themselves on an international basis. By traversing international boundaries in this manner, they could aspire to emulate the revolutions of 1848 in the future. Marx was deeply engaged in the First International. However, the First International soon devolved into discord, particularly between a more rigorously communist faction led by Marx and an anarchist faction led by the Russian revolutionary Mikhail Bakunin, a pivotal figure in the annals of political anarchism. The contention reached its zenith at a conference in The Hague in the Netherlands in 1872, and the First International effectively disintegrated in the subsequent years. A Second International would not surface until 1889, following Marx's demise. The division within the First International was, in many respects, fueled by the events of 1871. In mid-March of that year, as France, especially the city of Paris, endeavored to recuperate from the shock of its rapid defeat by Prussia in the Franco-Prussian War, radical political groups had taken control of the French capital. The Paris Commune would govern the city for 2.5 months, before its violent suppression by the government of the nascent Third French Republic. culminating in the deaths of between 10,000 and 20,000 individuals. The Commune cannot be entirely construed as a communist revolution, as the communards constituted a loose coalition of political radicals. Nonetheless, it undoubtedly entailed communist and radical socialist constituents. Marx engaged in a flurry of activities from London upon receiving news of what was occurring in Paris in March 1871. The treatise that he composed in response to it was entitled The Civil War in France, although by the time he completed it, the Commune had already been suppressed and the text required editing to render it in the past tense for publication that summer. We obtain a sense of how excessively optimistic Marx's perspective on the Commune was from this excerpt. Wonderful indeed was the transformation the Commune had accomplished in Paris. No longer was there any trace of the deceptive Paris of the Second Empire. No longer was Paris a meeting point for British landlords, Irish absentees, American ex-slaveholders and unscrupulous individuals, Russian ex-serf owners, and Wallachian boyars. No nocturnal burglaries, hardly any robberies. In fact, for the first time since the days of February 1848, the streets of Paris were secure, and that without any police presence whatsoever. Whatever the virtues of the Commune may or may not have been, portraying Paris as a model of peace and safety in the late spring of 1871 stretches credulity. The events of the early 1870s, with the fleeting prospect of a new revolution in France, followed by the gradual decline of the First International in the subsequent years, constituted the final period of significant political engagement by Marx. He reached the age of 60 in 1878, and by that time his health was seriously deteriorating. He continued to write, although much of his time was consumed in preparing the second and third volumes of Das Kapital, two works which he never fully completed and published. Engels would accomplish this after his death. A number of his later writings, correspondences, and minor publications are noteworthy. For example, in 1881, he conversed with Vera Zasulich, a Russian communist who is a forgotten yet formative figure in the history of the movement in that nation, regarding whether Russia could aspire towards communism, the traditional Marxist perspective being that societies would need to transition from feudalism to capitalism, then from capitalism to socialism, and from socialism to communism, with industrialization being an essential process in the evolution of capitalism into socialism. In light of future developments, it was an intriguing correspondence. By this time, several thousand copies of Marx's works had been published in Russian, although he would have found it quite curious that Russia would soon become the epicenter of the communist movement, considering that he had envisioned it as a political ideology suitable for nations such as England, Germany, or even France, which were already well along the path of industrialization and possessed an urban proletariat to propel the revolution as a result. Karl's spouse, Jenny, passed away in December 1881. His personal health had begun to deteriorate by that time, and it subsequently declined sharply. In fact, his health had never been robust. As early as the late 1830s, Marx had been exempted from military service in Prussia due to health issues. The specifics of his condition are not entirely definitive. He may have been experiencing some form of pleurisy even at this early juncture. This situation was exacerbated by difficulties associated with his borderline alcoholism, intensified by substandard living conditions in London. From a contemporary health standpoint, he made numerous misguided choices thereafter, including extensive working hours, an inadequate diet, smoking, and later incorporating sleep aids into his routine as he developed insomnia in later life. He may have had additional health conditions. Ultimately, it is challenging to discern from the limited medical documentation available. What is evident is that he contracted a case of catarrh at the start of 1882, which impaired his capacity to breathe adequately. His health continued to deteriorate from that point onward, and Marx passed away in London on March 14, 1883, at the age of 64. At that time, he was nearly destitute, and friends and political associates pooled their resources to arrange his burial in Highgate Cemetery within the city. The funeral was a very simple ceremony, attended by Engels and approximately a dozen other individuals, hardly a significant turnout for a figure whose writings would, for better or worse, exert an immense influence on the century that followed his life. Even by the time of Marx's death in 1883, Substantial advancements had been achieved in reforming the most severe aspects of the relationship between the business and working classes that had developed during the initial decades of industrialization. Back in 1847, when he and Engels had been conceptualizing what would later become the Communist Manifesto, the British government under Lord John Russell enacted the Factories Act of 1847, commonly referred to as the 10 Hours Act. This legislation established the principle that factory owners and managers should never mandate women and children to work beyond 63 hours per week, a maximum limit that was rapidly reduced to 58 hours in 1848. Although this may still appear to be a considerable number of hours, it represented the commencement of a reform process that gradually improved the working conditions of the proletariat during the latter half of the 19th century. Initially, governments introduced these measures with relative willingness, yet workers also began to leverage their collective bargaining power through trade unions and labor movements late in the century and into the 20th century to secure greater concessions from the business classes. This era was one of significant tension, often marred by violent confrontations such as the Homestead Strike in Pennsylvania in the United States in 1892, when American industrialist Henry Clay Frick deployed strikebreakers to confront his own workers. However, over time, substantial concessions were achieved in the decades preceding and following Marx's death. Still, Marx would not have found satisfaction with this. His observations regarding industrialization had convinced him that a comprehensive restructuring of the entire ownership system was imperative, advocating for communism rather than socialism or labor reform. Many individuals concurred with him. Throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, numerous communist movements began to emerge in industrialized European nations. Many of these movements did not adopt names such as the Communist Party, but instead used titles like the Socialist Workers' Party or similar, nevertheless adhering to many of the principles espoused by Marx and Engels. One such organization was the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, established in the city of Minsk, which was part of the Russian Empire at the time. It quickly fractured into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, the former of which would instigate the October Revolution in Russia in 1917, marking the rise to power of the Communist Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The emergence of the Soviet Union would motivate numerous imitators, and as the First World War concluded in 1918, communist regimes were momentarily established in locations such as Hungary and various major cities in Germany. Ultimately, it was the defeat of fascism and the onset of the Cold War from 1945 onward that allowed communism to manifest as a global force. At the peak of the Cold War, between the 1960s and 1980s, nearly half of the world's nations claimed to be communist states. Of course, all of this raises questions regarding the extent to which Marx was accountable for the emergence of these authoritarian regimes, many of which perpetrated heinous atrocities against their own populations, none more so than the Soviet Union and Maoist China, two nations where tens of millions of individuals perished in man-made famines between the early 1930s and the mid-1960s, and where state terror ravaged entire societies. Some historians propose that Marx bears a degree of responsibility for the way in which his idealistic utopian notions of collectivization and the abolition of private property rights engendered the conditions that led socialist countries to devolve into authoritarian dystopias. Indeed, it could be asserted that this represents the juncture at which Marxism and socialism diverge, as it is impossible to remove private property rights from a populace without the application of force, given that individuals who possess private property, often accumulated over generations, rarely consent to relinquishing the fruits of their labor voluntarily. It has also been posited that, due to this fact, along with the circumstance that the majority of communist revolutions occurred in nations that were previously under autocratic governance, such as Russia under the Tsars, the revolutionary regimes simply replicated and intensified the most detrimental characteristics of the regimes they displaced. There is little doubt that Marx possessed a sincere concern for the quality of life of the millions of individuals who, due to the rapid industrialization in the 19th century, were cast into squalor, and that his ideas were meant to provide everyone in society sufficient food and wealth to live comfortably. He would certainly have been horrified by the horrific death toll that transpired under the 20th century regimes that adhered to his ideology. Ultimately, Karl Marx remains one of the most influential and controversial thinkers in history. His theories regarding class struggle and scientific socialism transformed political and economic thought, inspiring movements and revolutions around the globe. While some view him as a visionary who revealed the shortcomings of capitalism, others contend that his ideas resulted in oppressive regimes that failed to realize true equality. Thus, was Marx a thinker ahead of his time, or were his ideas simply utopian dreams that could not endure the test of reality? Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let me know what topics you'd like to see next.